Mark and Laura had been together for 30 years. 30 years of shared life, 30 years of routine, 30 years of habits that had become as essential as morning coffee or the evening newspaper. They were like old, dear friends who knew each other so well they could understand one another without a word. They had an adult son who, though living on his own, often visited them, stable jobs, a cozy home that felt as familiar as an old painting, and a set of daily responsibilities that followed the rhythm of the week. Yet with every passing year, something important, something invisible, slipped away. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but between them it felt as though the spark that had once warmed their relationship was gradually fading. The passion that had once been the foundation of their bond was now overshadowed by the monotony of daily life. Their days were reduced to kind morning greetings, where every word felt predictable and required no special attention. Silent evenings spent in front of the TV, each absorbed in their own thoughts, and conversations revolving around mundane topics, bills, repairs, groceries. Their emotions seemed to have vanished, leaving behind only a shadow of the passion they once shared. Mark noticed it first, though he didn't fully admit it to himself at the time. It was as if he no longer saw Laura. His gaze didn't linger on her figure anymore. He didn't search her face for the special expression he had once loved. She had become another part of the everyday scenery, like his morning coffee or the evening rain tapping on the windows. He no longer felt fear, excitement, or that delicate joy he once experienced when looking forward to their time together. Laura felt the same. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt like a woman, when her heart raced at Mark's simple touch, or when she caught his gaze and felt desired. She was losing confidence that her body could still awaken the passion that had once ignited their relationship. Laura couldn't quite pinpoint what they had lost, but she sensed a vast emptiness between them, one that couldn't be filled with small talk. They both tried to bring back what they had lost, to breathe life into their relationship. They tried different things: vacations at resorts, trips to new cities, cooking classes. At first these efforts brought some relief, distracting them from the dullness of their conversations, but soon, the same old habits, the same mundane routines, crept back in. These attempts couldn't restore the magic that had once made their lives vibrant and full. One evening, while they were having dinner, Laura spoke up. "You know, I've been thinking for a long time. We need to do something different, something so out of the ordinary that it helps us feel alive again, to feel real. We need something that brings back not just passion, but a zest for life. I think we should start dancing." Mark raised his eyebrows and set down his fork. He didn't quite understand at first. "Dancing?" he asked with a hint of doubt in his voice. "You mean like ballroom dancing or something? You know, I haven't danced in years, and besides, I'm 53. I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I'm not sure it'll work." Laura smiled and placed her hand on his. There was something in her eyes that made him pause. "It's not just about dancing," she said. "It doesn't have to be traditional. It has to be something passionate, something that can reignite the energy that once connected us. I'm talking about tango. Do you remember when we danced that night in Moscow? How we felt every movement, every touch. It wasn't just a dance, it was pure magic." Mark hesitated. He remembered that night, how they had danced in an old ballroom, surrounded by soft light and music that seemed to fill their very souls. They had truly connected on a level where words weren't needed. But that was many years ago. Much had changed since then. He had aged, lost some of his agility, and his body wasn't as light or strong as it had been. "Are you sure?" he asked, not hiding his doubts. "We're not the same people we were back then." Laura looked at him with an expression that left no room for refusal. It was the look of a woman who didn't just want to reclaim the past, but to rediscover something deeper, the profound connection they had once shared. "I'm sure," she said. "We can try. Even if it's not easy, it'll at least give us a chance to change something. You'd do this for me, wouldn't you?" Mark nodded. He realized how important this was to Laura, and if he wanted to reclaim even a fraction of what they'd lost, he had to try. "All right," he said, standing up from the table and extending his hand. "Let's give it a shot." Laura's smile lit up, and in her eyes, he saw a spark. The very spark she had been searching for in their relationship. She took his hand, and in that moment, Mark felt something stir within himself too. Maybe it was just a small flicker, but it was a start. And even if it was only the first step, it was a step toward the future, a step toward reclaiming what they once had. So began their new attempt to find life, to find each other again. And though the road ahead would be long, at least they were willing to try. The dance studio had a unique atmosphere. Laura and Mark, despite their nervousness and doubts, had finally started their lessons. The room was softly lit, the light reflecting off the mirrors on the walls, and the air was filled with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. For both of them, this was something entirely new, a far cry from their routine lives. Laura, with her graceful figure and confident stride, felt her body slowly recalling old movements. Each new session brought her joy, and she could feel not only her physical form returning, but also the spirit of freedom that had once been so dear to her in her youth. Her eyes shone with excitement. She felt alive again. Mark, however, was feeling the pressure. Unlike Laura, he wasn't in good shape. Extra weight, a lack of flexibility, the exhaustion from years of work and daily routines, all of it had taken a toll. He felt how uncooperative his body had become, how every movement was a struggle. But Laura was there beside him. Her support, her encouraging words, and her warm looks gave him strength. She reminded him that it wasn't about perfect execution. It was about the attempt, the process, and the fact that they were doing this together. That gave him the courage to keep going. Every lesson became more than just a dance class for Mark. It was a revelation. He wasn't just learning to dance, he was rediscovering feelings he hadn't experienced in years. Laura's care, her support, and the sense that she was there for him, ready to help and cheer him on. Then one day, during a session, the instructor announced that the pairs would be switching partners. Laura and Mark exchanged surprised looks. Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He had grown used to Laura by his side, to her encouraging eyes full of warmth. Now he was about to face a new partner, and the change filled him with unease. In the next moment, he found himself standing next to a woman he had never met before. Her name was Jane. She was young, slender, with sharp, confident lines in her posture. From the moment they paired up, Mark felt his newfound confidence with Laura dissolve. He looked at Jane and was acutely aware of all his flaws, which he had tried so hard to ignore. Jane was much younger, her figure flawless, and her expression seemed distant. She didn't look impressed by the prospect of dancing with a man who didn't resemble a classical dancer, someone she clearly hadn't expected to be her partner. Jane didn't hide her dissatisfaction. Her gaze said it all. She wasn't thrilled about having a partner who was overweight, clumsy, and clearly not fit for such a refined dance as tango. Her face was tight with tension. For her, this was unexpected, and her discontent was becoming increasingly apparent. But the instructor, as usual, insisted. The pairs had been chosen, and they had no choice but to follow the instructions. And so, their first dance began. Jane moved with ease and confidence, trying to maintain her composure. Mark, on the other hand, felt completely out of his element. He didn't know what to do with his hands, his feet often slipped in the wrong direction, and his entire body tensed with each mistake. He was uncertain and let out heavy sighs. But then somehow, he managed to take a step in the right direction. Then another. It wasn't graceful, but his movements had a certain resilience, a quiet determination he didn't even realize he possessed. Then something unexpected happened. As Mark tried to find the rhythm and match the pace of the dance, Jane began to feel something surprising. She felt his support. Yes, he wasn't as slim or as flexible as she was used to, but there was strength and steadiness in his hands. Even if his movements weren't perfectly smooth and refined, they created an atmosphere of reassurance. His presence became her anchor. He didn't rush her, didn't push her, but patiently waited for her to make the next move. His care for her as a dance partner, his respect for her pace, made an impression. Jane couldn't quite put her finger on what was happening to her. At first, her irritation and annoyance started to fade. He turned out to be not such a mismatched partner after all. True, he wasn't perfect, but he provided a kind of support that unexpectedly warmed her heart. Every move he made, even if it lacked elegance, felt like a gentle guide. Step by step, turn by turn, her frustration melted away. In its place, she began to feel something much deeper. Something that could be called respect. His confident, though unpolished movements now seemed strong and right. He wasn't trying to make her a part of himself. He allowed her to remain herself while following her rhythm. That filled her with a strange sense of security. When the dance ended, Jane found herself reluctant to let go of his hand. It was an odd but thrilling feeling. She hadn't expected anything from this man. Yet now she felt that dancing with him was not only possible, but even enjoyable. At that moment, she realized that this dance had become more than just a lesson for her. Her heart was racing, and she sensed that her perspective on tango, relationships, and even Mark himself had shifted. He wasn't just her dance partner. He had become something more than she had anticipated. The wisdom and confidence he displayed in his movements revealed something new within her. At the same time, Mark, despite his awkwardness, also felt a change. He realized he wasn't just performing steps, but was beginning to feel the music, and that dance could be as much an emotional process as a physical one. Perhaps this was only the first step in their journey, but for Mark, it was a step that changed not only his view of dancing, but also of himself. The dance hall was alive with the sound of music and the soft shuffle of feet. Flashes of light bounced off the polished floor, reflecting the silhouettes of people engrossed in the rhythm, each consumed by their movements, yet part of a greater collective flow. Mark and Jane stood at the center of this world. Everything around them seemed to dissolve into the music and motion, and only now did Mark realize how intensely focused he was on not making a mistake. Jane, though initially uneasy, found her confidence growing with each step. But then her attention was drawn to a soft, almost imperceptible laugh. It was a sound she knew, something familiar and intimate, like an overplayed melody capable of stirring warm yet bittersweet memories. Laura. Standing near the edge of the room, bathed in light, Laura laughed and chatted with a man Jane didn't recognize. In that moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background, as Jane watched Laura immerse herself in conversation with this stranger. Laura was her friend, yet Jane felt a pang of irritation. Perhaps unconsciously, her gaze sharpened. Laura's laughter echoed through the room, amplifying an odd, growing sensation inside Jane. She saw Laura laughing effortlessly, oblivious to her husband's awkwardness and hesitation on the dance floor. It was as if everything was fine, as if there wasn't a void between them that Jane herself had felt so keenly. She watched Laura carry herself with calm confidence, showing no interest in Mark's struggles. A strange dissatisfaction stirred in Jane. How could Laura be so indifferent to him? Was he not important? And why were her own emotions becoming so tangled? Her gaze drifted down to Mark's hand, still holding hers. The dance was over, but his fingers hadn't let go. It was unexpected. She felt a jolt of something unnameable. His hand, his presence, lingering with her even as the music faded. Why was he still holding her hand when their dance was over? Why didn't he let go when it was no longer necessary? His persistence was striking, even as other couples dispersed around them. A flicker of guilt flashed through Jane's mind. But for what? She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't crossed any boundaries. She was just a dance partner, nothing more. Her mind told her there was no reason for doubt, yet in her soul an indefinable unease took root. It was a peculiar mix of awkwardness and guilt. She felt oddly responsible for the fact that Mark hadn't released her hand, though it was the natural thing to expect. It had been just one dance. Yet now, standing there with him, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something significant had shifted, though it wasn't clear what. As the music finally came to a stop, Jane took a step forward, intending to break their connection and return to her seat. But just as she moved, her attention was drawn again to Laura. She stood nearby with her partner, looking directly at Jane, her expression unreadable but somehow filled with an unexpected intensity. Jane froze, unsure of what to anticipate. In that moment, she felt an odd sense that Laura held the power to determine what would happen next. Laura approached her without any hint of anger or irritation. Her face bore a light smile, but her gaze was steady and deliberate. "You're not at fault," Laura said softly and calmly. "You're a good dancer. And for me, there are other men in this room." The words took Jane by surprise, though perhaps she had expected something like them. Laura spoke without judgment, her tone entirely neutral, leaving no room for accusations. She made no move to interfere, nor did she regard Jane as a threat. It was as if she had quietly accepted that Mark dancing with Jane was just another part of life, not something of great consequence. Jane felt a strange mix of relief and frustration in those words. It was both liberating and unsettling. Laura's tone was so composed and nonchalant, as though none of it truly mattered. It wasn't personal to her. To Laura, Jane was simply another dance partner. It was both simple and profoundly complex. Suddenly, Jane became acutely aware of a presence behind her, a sharp, almost scrutinizing gaze. Turning, she found Mark watching them from a distance. His expression carried an unfamiliar detachment, something that unsettled her further. It made her question her place in this unfolding narrative. Where did she fit in this triangle? Where was Laura? Where was Mark? And where was she? And how would it all end? For a few more moments they all stood there, as if each were lost in their own thoughts and emotions. But the silence between them felt ambiguous, undefined. Jane couldn't make sense of what was happening inside her. She could still feel the warmth of Mark's hand, even after the dance had ended. That sensation lingered in her, transformed somehow. Yet the realization dawned that all these strange, incomprehensible feelings were part of something beyond explanation. What would happen next? Jane couldn't tell. And perhaps it was this very uncertainty that remained the strongest and strangest feeling of all. The next dance turned into a real challenge for Mark. While he tried to focus on the steps, his attention kept drifting toward Laura. It wasn't just a difficult task, it felt like a battle between his mind and emotions. He was supposed to stay in the rhythm, lead his partner, yet he constantly caught himself glancing in his wife's direction. His thoughts were tangled, and even though he was physically present, dancing with Jane, his soul and focus were somewhere else, where Laura danced with another man. Every glance, every movement Laura made in the arms of that other man reverberated painfully in his heart. Jealousy crept over him like a shadow, consuming everything. He couldn't believe how easily she seemed to move on, dancing with someone else as if it were fine, as if their once deep connection meant nothing. Laura, with her effortless grace, danced freely, enjoying the moment with her new partner, while Mark felt his heart constrict with hurt. The feeling wouldn't let him go. Mark struggled to bring himself back to the dance, but his mind remained trapped elsewhere. The image of Laura laughing and smiling at another man replayed endlessly in his head, leaving no room for anything else. He became aware of how unsteady his movements were, how each step seemed out of sync with the music, how his body faltered. His hands began to tremble, and even as Jane subtly guided him, trying to help, he couldn't focus. Jane was perceptive and noticed the change instantly. She felt his hand grow colder, his grip less sure. He was barely holding on to her, and his steps grew increasingly uncertain. Others in the ballroom began to notice, but for Jane, it was particularly painful. She felt powerless to support him any further. His attention, like a magnet, pulled irresistibly toward Laura. His gaze wasn't on her but locked on his wife, who seemed utterly absorbed in her own world. Jane tried to ignore it, continuing the dance. But with each step, her confidence wavered. It became clear to her that Mark had lost faith in her. He wasn't seeing her, wasn't hearing her, no matter how she tried to bring him back. His thoughts were consumed by Laura, and that realization left Jane feeling hollow. Every turn, every move of her legs became less graceful, less assured. She could no longer focus on the dance because her thoughts crashed against the invisible wall Mark had erected between them. When the tension became unbearable, Mark stopped. He let go of her hand without meeting her eyes, and offered a brief, apologetic gesture of thanks. His face was tight, his eyes empty. He said nothing unnecessary. Then he turned and walked away toward Laura, leaving Jane standing in the center of the ballroom. She stood frozen, watching his retreating figure, her heart racing, not just from exertion, but from everything that had just unfolded. For Jane, this was more than a failed dance. It felt like she had been reduced from an active participant to a tool in someone else's game. She realized in that moment that her presence there was more than just a fleeting role as his dance partner. She was merely a backdrop, a stage for the emotions and struggles of this couple to play out. Her own feelings didn't matter to Mark, nor, it seemed, to Laura. It was all about their relationship, and she couldn't escape the painful truth that she was merely a temporary fixture in their story. Jane stood there for a few more seconds, trying to collect herself. But when her gaze returned to the bustling ballroom, everything around her lost its meaning again. The music played, couples swirled, but she was no longer part of it. She had slipped into a different reality, a world where her own emotions and experiences didn't belong. She felt as though her existence had become weightless, insignificant. She was there, but she was also apart, detached. Her confidence and effort as a partner had evaporated, leaving only bitterness and isolation in their place. The lively ballroom couldn't mask her loneliness. She couldn't help but notice how life around her continued uninterrupted, while she remained stuck in the shadows. Even as Laura laughed and danced with another man, Jane understood that her own life wouldn't mirror that ease. At some point, she realized that all her attempts to be a meaningful part of this dance were futile. All she could be was a tool in someone else's game. That realization hurt, but it was necessary. Jane could no longer ignore what was happening around her, how she had become a mere part of something that held no true meaning for her. She let go of the last hope that her efforts and attention could change the situation. She wasn't part of their story. She was just a temporary passenger on someone else's journey. Jane stood in the center of the room, her thoughts tangled like threads in a knot. Emotions were flooding her, but she didn't know what to do with them. Everything that had happened turned out to be so much more complicated than just a dance. It wasn't just a couple dancing in the studio, it was a whirlwind of feelings and contradictions. A storm that couldn't always be stopped. Love, jealousy, longing, pain, and desire, all intertwined, becoming part of what was happening between Mark and Laura. Every glance, every gesture they exchanged couldn't leave either of them indifferent. And in that moment, when the instructor called for a break, Jane felt she needed to say something. She wasn't ready to face this conflict, but now seeing them with Laura, she realized that her presence here had become part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. This wasn't just a dance lesson. It was a scene from their life where each step, each movement revealed emotions hidden after years of being together. Jane walked up to Laura, feeling unsure of herself, and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be the cause of." Her words hung in the air, but Laura, standing before her, didn't look surprised. On the contrary, she looked at Jane with eyes full of softness and understanding, not judgment. It was as if Laura recognized something more in her words than just an apology. A look crossed Laura's face that was hard to decipher, but it clearly indicated she understood much more than it seemed. Laura took a step forward, and as she approached Jane, she gently said, "You're not at fault," her voice calm and warm, as if she'd already been through this herself. "We're all looking for something to revive our feelings, something to make us feel again. Dance, like everything else in life, can be what helps us remember what we lost. You don't need to apologize, we just forgot what love really is." Jane stood there, unsure of what to say. Laura was right. But the woman's words still felt heavy, like stones. Yet at the same time, they seemed both liberating and condemning. Jane couldn't help but feel that, in this moment, there was an invisible barrier between them. Although they were both here, in the same room, in the same dance studio, they were like two opposites that couldn't meet. Yet, something in Laura's words made Jane feel that they were all connected by invisible threads. Threads not just of dance, but of complex, unresolved issues that had lingered for years. Jane didn't know what to do with this realization. She was part of the dance, part of this couple, but at the same time, she was an outsider who came to a class and accidentally became a witness to hidden emotions. And now, hearing Laura's words, she felt that her own feelings and doubts were nothing compared to what these two people were going through. They were searching, and their search overshadowed even what she might have felt. It all felt painful and at the same time, freeing. Like she was looking into a mirror that reflected not only her feelings but also the emotions of this couple. She understood. The dance with Mark, while important to her, had become more than just a movement to music for them. It had become a mirror, reflecting all the hidden, perhaps even forgotten feelings they had been keeping inside. Tango, passionate, intense, and emotional, had opened up not only physical closeness, but also a spiritual space that had been lost over the years. It had become what brought them together, what opened their eyes to the feelings they both feared to acknowledge. Even though Jane was on the sidelines, she had become part of this process. She stood in the room, watching as Mark went back to his wife. He approached Laura with a hesitant smile, as if trying to find the right words to bring back what seemed lost. There was a mixed look in his eyes, one that seemed both apologetic and seeking to restore the lost connection. Laura accepted him, without asking questions, but her gaze was full of hidden meaning, something Jane would probably never fully understand. It was a personal story, a story they were living between themselves. In that moment, Jane realized that her place in this story wasn't as important as she had thought. It was the place of an observer, someone who became part of someone else's life, but was powerless to affect its course. The dance partners returned to the floor, but now everything was different. For Laura and Mark, this dance had become something more than just physical movement. It was a moment that might bring back their feelings, their aspirations, and maybe change something in their relationship. The tango wasn't over, it was just the beginning of a new path, a path they would have to walk together. They were finally starting to realize that dance wasn't just about the moves, it was about how we find each other again in the most unexpected places. Jane, standing off to the side, watched as this couple began to restore what seemed lost. She felt her own emotions settling. She understood that her role in this dance was complete. She hadn't left a mark on their lives, but her presence may have been the catalyst that made them see each other in a new way. Tango, like everything in their lives, wasn't just about the movement of bodies. It was about the movement of souls. And now, in this moment, they were starting their journey anew, together.